Declan Ward wasn't supposed to be home. His day was scheduled down to the minute, his driver already headed for the bridge, the Ward estate sealed behind iron gates, like a place where feelings didn't survive. Then he heard it laughter. Real laughter. He stopped in the shadow of an oak, suddenly afraid to breathe. In the garden, his 4-year-old twins, Evan and Graham, were flying on the swing set he'd restored and never once used. Their faces were lit up. Their bodies were loose, alive. For months, Vanessa Crowell, his flawless fiancée, had told him the boys were out of control, that they barely spoke, that the new caregiver was crossing lines. But the boys weren't breaking down. They were clinging to Madeline Pierce. Madeline, in yellow cleaning gloves, moved between the swings with quiet precision like she'd memorized every fear his sons couldn't name. When Evan stumbled, she crouched, soothed him with a breath and a kiss, and the tears vanished. Graham leaned into her shoulder like it was home. Then Graham shouted, clear as glass. Higher. Declan's stomach dropped. Vanessa had sworn he barely talked. Declan took one step forward, then froze. If he showed himself now, the mask would snap back into place. The lie would tighten, and he'd never see the truth again. So he stayed hidden. And right on cue, heels clicked on stone. Vanessa appeared, perfect and smiling, and her voice sliced the afternoon in two. This is pathetic. I pay you to clean, not to play mother. Behind the oak, Declan's jaw locked. He wasn't leaving. He was setting a trap. And before nightfall, someone in his house was going to forget the cameras were watching. If you want the next part, like this video. Share it with someone who loves a twist. And subscribe, you won't want to miss what comes next. Declan stepped back from the oak tree's shadow, as if withdrawing from a cut that had just opened. He didn't walk out into the garden. He didn't let Vanessa see the eyes that had just witnessed what, for months, he'd been stripped of. He circled to the side path, moving through the stone-paved corridor like a man returning on schedule, shoulders squared, stride even, face so composed it bordered on cold. The sliding glass door parted, and the house received him with the scent of polished wood and air conditioning turned a little too cool, that familiar chill he'd once called order. Inside him, that order had just collapsed. But Declan Ward didn't live on feeling. He lived on control. He walked in as if nothing had happened, as if the laughter outside didn't exist, as if the moment Graham had shouted higher hadn't driven straight into him like living proof. Vanessa was already there waiting, like a painting hung in place. Perfect hair, a dress without a single wrinkle, a smile bright as a chandelier. When she saw Declan, she stepped forward just enough to look caring, then set her hand on his lapel as if correcting a small detail. You're home earlier than I thought, Vanessa said, her voice soft as velvet. That's good. I've just finished giving the two boys a snack. Their schedule today is going very well. A little activity in the garden, then inside for baths. I'm trying to keep everything in routine, you know. Children need discipline. Declan looked into her eyes, the kind that could smile without ever warming. He gave a slight nod, like a man agreeing with a report. Yeah, he said, voice ordinary. I heard them laughing. Vanessa didn't blink. She smiled wider, as if that were her accomplishment. I'm doing my best, she replied. Maybe the boys are starting to get used to how I manage things. I told you. All it takes is rules. Declan walked into the living room, draped his coat over the arm of the leather chair, and glanced across a calendar pinned to a board. Time blocks shaded in colors as neat as a perfect plan. He touched the paper's edge, and it felt like touching a coat of paint laid over the truth. He turned back and let fall what sounded like praise, but was really a hook. They seem lighter today. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. Because I don't let things get chaotic, she said at once, then tipped her head, her tone shifting into a half-gentle reproach. Honestly, Madeline goes too far sometimes. She's overly emotional. I worry it makes the boys cling to her, and then later it'll be even harder to teach them. You've seen it too. She crosses boundaries. Declan felt his jaw tighten, not because she was lying, because she dared to lie when he'd just seen the truth with his own eyes. But he didn't react. He let silence drop like a curtain. Call her in here, Declan said. Vanessa's expression changed immediately, like a woman stepping neatly into the right role. Of course, she answered, and pressed the bell. A moment later, Madeline appeared at the kitchen doorway. She still wore yellow gloves, her hair pinned up neatly, a streak of sweat left on her face where she hadn't had time to wipe it away. She looked at Declan quickly, not with invitation, but with assessment. the way someone looks at the sky before a storm. Vanessa smiled at Madeline, the smile of someone who knew she stood higher and wanted to remind her of it. "Madeline," Vanessa said, her voice so polite an outsider would mistake it for concern, "I need to repeat this. Your job is to keep the house tidy and support the boys' routine. I don't want to see actions that confuse the children about roles. Too much attachment isn't good." Madeline opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped. She swallowed it down. Declan stood still, not stepping in. He watched the small details, the way Madeline held her hands in front of her stomach, the way her shoulders drew in slightly, as if she were standing in an invisible cold wind. He watched Vanessa, the way she kept her tone even, as if every word were spotless. That was the most dangerous thing of all. Declan asked a simple question, his voice unchanged. "Do you think the boys are okay, Madeline?" Madeline looked straight at him. Just 1 second, long enough for him to see something at the bottom of her eyes that was both afraid and unyielding. "Yes, sir," she said. "The boys are okay when everything is consistent." Vanessa gave a light laugh. "See?" she said to Declan. "She understands too. Consistency. Discipline. I'm trying to build it back." Declan nodded, not to Vanessa, but to the decision that had just formed in his mind. "All right," he said. "Stick to the schedule." He turned away, ending the conversation like a busy man. But before he left the room, he flicked one glance at Madeline, brief enough that Vanessa wouldn't catch it, clear enough that Madeline would understand he'd seen. Not that he'd seen what she was doing, that he'd seen what she was trying to hold together. Evening came, and the house sank into silence. Vanessa sat in the living room watching the news, the television's voice blending into the hum of the air conditioning like a layer of white noise. Declan moved down the hallway upstairs, his steps making no sound. He paused to look into the children's room. Evan and Graham were asleep. 2 small bodies lay on their sides, blankets pulled up to their chests, a stuffed bear between them like a bridge. Declan stood there longer than he normally would. He watched tiny fingers clutching the corner of a blanket, watched lashes resting on cheeks, watched a world he'd thought he could protect with iron gates, with contracts, with money. He'd been wrong. He'd paid for his own absence. He'd bought a substitute for the role of father, then convinced himself it was the best way. But the laughter in the garden had stripped everything bare. No one needed his assets to laugh. They needed safety, and he'd just realized that, inside this very house, safety was something being bargained away. Declan took out his phone, walked into his study, and closed the door. The desk lamp cast its light onto a surface as clean as an interrogation room. He dialed Miles Keene. "Miles," Declan said, without preface, "I want you to check the entire security system in the house. Everything. Especially the second-floor hallway and the area near the children's room. I want to know what every camera can see and what it can't see." The line went quiet for a beat, as if Miles had been waiting for this. "Understood," Miles said. "I'll check it right away." Declan set the phone down and stared at the night beyond the window. He heard Vanessa's footsteps somewhere downstairs, the sound of a glass touching a tabletop. He could hear her confidence in every breath. Declan didn't rage in the way that explodes. His anger was a plan. He returned to the children's room once more before bed. He didn't touch the boys. He only stood there, looking at 2 small faces, and for the first time in a long while, he let regret run straight into his chest without resisting it. "Dad's here," he whispered, more promise than sentence. No one answered. But Declan heard another kind of answer, clearer than words. A laugh, a single, higher, and a truth he could no longer ignore. The phone vibrated close to midnight. A message from Miles, brief, with not one extra word. "There's an abnormal blind spot. It's not a technical fault. It's as if someone wanted certain areas not to be recorded." Declan read it once more, then locked the screen. In the dark, his mouth didn't curve, but his eyes went darker. He had what he needed most to begin. A sign, a crack. And from that crack, he would let the truth spill out. The next morning, Madeline woke before the sun could warm the window panes, as if her body had grown used to never sleeping deeply. She stood in the ward kitchen, washing each cup until it shone by hand, even though the dishwasher was right beside her, because the steady sound of running water made it easier for her to breathe. Last night, Miles's message about unusual blind spots still clung to her thoughts like metallic dust. She didn't know how much Declan had seen, but she knew Vanessa had started pushing her into a familiar circle. A small deviation, a polite reminder, and then an insinuation sharp enough to turn her into someone who crossed boundaries. For people with power, a single story was enough. For someone like her, a single suspicion could make everything collapse. Madeline dried her hands on her apron and looked up at the color-coded schedule board, at the neat lines listing meal times, bath times, bedtime, as if life could be framed by a marker. She knew schedules didn't protect anyone. She'd believed in papers like that once, when she was little, when people told her that if she behaved, if she followed the rules, there would be a stable roof over her head. But a stable roof, for Madeline, had always been like a bus, arriving and leaving without promising anything. She grew up in places where the caregiver's name changed faster than the seasons, where a suitcase stayed ready in the corner because she could be moved at any time, where she learned to smile and say yes, ma'am, before she learned to trust. Later, when she was old enough to live on her own, the instability only changed shape. It didn't disappear. There was one winter she thought she'd finally found her footing, and then a medical bill came down like a slab of stone. In only a few weeks, her savings evaporated. Her landlord knocked, his voice colder than the wind outside. She remembered exactly what it felt like to stand on the front steps, clutching a bag of her things, her heart pounding as if it wanted to flee her chest, terrified people would look at her the way they looked at trouble. Since then, Madeline had lived by one rule: don't give anyone a reason to say your name with the word nuisance attached to it. And now, in this mansion, she could feel it clearly. Vanessa was trying to create that reason. Madeline set the last cup on the rack, drew in a breath, then went upstairs and knocked lightly on Declan's office door. When his voice came, "Come in," she opened it and stood at the threshold, keeping just enough distance out of habit, out of self-defense. Declan sat behind his desk in a white shirt with his sleeves neatly rolled, his face unreadable, but his eyes like deep water. Nothing on the desk was unnecessary. A stack of papers sat squared and waiting for her, as if it had been expecting her arrival. "What do you want to say?" he asked, without wasting words. Madeline laced her hands together beneath her apron. I think I should resign," she said, quiet but clear. "I don't want to cause trouble for your family." She didn't look at him when she said the word trouble. Just saying it made her throat go dry. Declan didn't frown, didn't ask why, as if he'd already predicted it. He only pushed the papers toward her, slowly. "You're not resigning," he said, his tone flat. "You're signing this." Madeline looked down. A contract, not a spoken promise. Black print, clear terms, authority and responsibility laid out like a map with borders. The salary was written out in words, enough to make her blink once because she wasn't sure she'd read it correctly. The work hours were defined, privacy was emphasized, and one particular line tightened her chest. She didn't have to face any allegation or dispute alone, and every official exchange had to go through the Ward family's attorney. Madeline looked up, her eyes briefly lost. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I'm just the help." Declan held her gaze. "You're the only person who's made me hear my son laugh," he replied, then paused as if holding back a surge of anger. "And I don't have a habit of missing it a second time." Madeline opened her mouth, then closed it again. She felt as if she were standing in front of a door she'd never once been allowed to open in her entire life. But she was still afraid. Afraid it was another trap, only more elegant. "I don't want to stand between you and her," Madeline said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to be turned into the reason everything blows up." Declan leaned back in his chair, his eyes not softening, but his voice lower. "You think you're the reason?" he asked. "I think I'm the excuse," Madeline said, and then the truth slipped out of her mouth as if she'd held it too long. "The boys don't cling to me because I'm special. They cling to me because they're scared." The room went so still it felt as if the air had been drawn out. Declan didn't ask what they were scared of the way a curious man would. He asked the way a man who'd already decided would ask. "Scared," he repeated, as if stamping an invisible page. Madeline nodded, her eyes dropping to the edge of the contract. She didn't give details. She only said enough for an intelligent person to understand. "There are times the air in the house changes," she said. "I can see it in the way they go quiet, in the way they look toward the hallway before they look at me. I'm only trying to keep things consistent. I'm only trying to let them know someone is listening." Declan set 2 fingers on the tabletop and tapped once, like a count. Then we remove what's making them afraid, he said, the sentence as short as an order. Madeline looked up. In that moment, what she saw in Declan wasn't fairy tale tenderness. She saw the cold certainty of a man used to ending problems through action. It made her feel both safer and more frightened. I can't fight her, Madeline whispered. You don't need to fight, Declan replied. You only need to do what you've been doing, and this time, you won't be alone. He said it like a lock clicking into place. Madeline felt the word alone touch the deepest place in her. The place where nights hugging a suitcase in a shelter still lay untouched. She took the pen, her hand shaking slightly, and signed her name on the last page as if signing onto a promise she didn't know whether she should trust. Declan stood. He didn't offer a handshake, only gave a single nod. Good, he said. Now go do your work. Madeline stepped back into the hallway, walking lightly as if afraid to make noise, but her chest didn't feel as hollow as it had when she'd walked in. She went down to the kitchen, prepared lunch according to the schedule, listened to the boys' small laughter drifting from the playroom, and tried to keep her breathing steady. By afternoon, when she went out back to collect the laundry, the phone in her pocket buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No name, no icon, only one cold line, like someone standing in the dark speaking straight into her ear. Leave before you become the reason everything falls apart. Madeline froze, the wind cutting across the yard and raising gooseflesh along her arms. She looked back at the house with its tall iron gate and windows bright as eyes. For the first time, she wasn't only afraid of Vanessa. She began to fear that someone was watching all of them. The next morning, the ward house ran like a polished machine, but Madeline felt there was a cord inside it being pulled tight to its limit. The anonymous message still sat on her phone screen like ink that hadn't dried, and every time she passed through the hallway, she had the sensation that someone was measuring her footsteps with an invisible ruler. Declan didn't mention the message, and he didn't ask her another question. He only looked at her once as he passed the kitchen, his gaze a silent reminder that he'd placed her under a roof, and that roof had its own laws. By late afternoon, Vanessa appeared in the house as if nothing had slipped out of rhythm, bringing a new schedule, a cream-colored dress, and a perfume so clean it felt unbelievable. She said there was a charity event tonight, a fundraiser for the city's Children's Foundation, where the press would be present, where handshakes and smiles would be photographed into proof of perfection. Declan would go with her, because that was what a man like him had to do when standing beside a woman like her. Madeline wasn't invited, of course, but she was given a list of things to prepare for the two boys, as if she were only part of the house's background, not the person who'd just been warned by a cold message. When the motorcade rolled out through the iron gate, Madeline stood at the window and watched it go, feeling as if a large mask had just been carried out to be displayed, while inside, the house became emptier than before. She tried to keep everything on schedule for Evan and Graham, but in her chest she kept thinking about the way Vanessa used the word discipline like jewelry, and the way Declan's silence stood like a wall. That evening, on the television screen in the kitchen, the local news ran a short segment about the event. Flashing lights, a red carpet, glasses of wine, polished laughter. Vanessa stood in the middle of it all like a perfect candle, her hand resting on Declan's arm, her eyes looking straight into the lens, her smile measured down to the millimeter. The host called her a devoted woman, a model of compassion. For a moment, the camera panned to Declan. He didn't smile broadly. He simply stood there, steady, his eyes dark as if he were looking through the glitter to count every gap. Vanessa pulled the whole story back to family, speaking of the twin boys, as if she were the one who'd held them through difficult nights, as if this house ran on her heart. Madeline listened with her hands tightening around the dish towel, not out of jealousy, but because she understood this was Vanessa's real power, the power that made people believe a story simply because it was told on a stage under the right light. When Declan returned, it was already late. There was no sound of heels echoing through the house. Vanessa walked into the living room, dropped her handbag, and let out a breath like someone who'd just completed her performance. Declan came in behind her, took off his coat, didn't speak about the party, didn't ask about the praise. Vanessa poured herself water, leaned against the kitchen counter as if tallying her victories, then looked around the house with the eyes of an owner. You see, she said, her tone light as if discussing the weather. A house like this needs a woman at the helm. Declan didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a beat long enough that Vanessa might have thought her words had landed where they needed to land. Then he only gave a short sound of agreement, without warmth, like a period at the end of a sentence. Madeline stood at the end of the hallway, holding a basket of toys she was carrying back to the playroom, and she heard that line the way she would hear an accidental confession. Vanessa wasn't talking about care. Vanessa was talking about control. Vanessa didn't want to be a mother. Vanessa wanted to be the owner. Madeline lowered her head, put the toys away, and tried to keep her face ordinary so she wouldn't be red. But inside she was clearer than she'd ever been that she wasn't only hired help. She was an obstacle in a plan of possession. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, Madeline walked through the hallway and saw Declan standing alone by the stairs, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but sharp. She caught fragments of Miles's name, heard wind through the speaker as if Miles were standing outside or inside a cold machine room. Declan only said a few words, enough to raise gooseflesh on Madeline's arms even though she didn't understand everything. Miles reported signs the internal network system had been interfered with before, not the kind of random glitch that happens by chance, but as if someone had logged in with control privileges. Someone had once had administrator access. Declan ended the call and lifted his eyes, catching Madeline at the end of the hallway. He didn't ask how much she'd heard. He only looked at her the way a man looks at an important piece, just placed in the right position. And Madeline understood that Vanessa's perfect mask out there was only half the game. The other half lay in the invisible wires running along the walls of the ward house, where someone had touched the system to create pockets of darkness that only the truth would fear being exposed to. The next morning, Miles came to the ward house not with the look of a technician, but with the caution of someone who'd lived long enough to understand there are things you don't say out loud. He didn't go through the front door. He came in through the side, the way people did when they worked for Declan and things started to smell dangerous. Declan brought Miles into the study and closed the door, leaving the house's noise outside like a curtain. On the desk, Declan had already laid out the security system diagram, small dots representing cameras lined along the hallway, the stairs, the entrances. Miles plugged a device into the network port. Eyes locked on the screen, fingers moving quick and clean. No wasted words, only letters streaming across a black background, timestamps, log lines. Declan stood behind him, silent enough the room felt as if the air had been pulled out. Then Miles stopped. He zoomed in on a section of data and pointed to an empty spot, a stretch with no recorded footage, not because a camera was broken, but because the angle had been adjusted just enough to skip an important section of hallway, exactly where it led toward the children's rooms. Miles pulled up the access history and showed Declan the system had been entered with the highest level of permissions, logins that didn't come from Declan's device or the security team's. Someone had touched it, not clumsily, not by accident, but precisely, like they were creating a deliberate pocket of darkness. Declan didn't ask who. He asked a different question, his voice low and steady like a blade laid on a table. Who could have that level of access? Miles said administrative rights had been set up when the system was upgraded, and there were many ways for someone who was in the house, close enough and knowledgeable enough, to get it. Declan nodded, not needing more. In his world, evidence didn't have to sing loudly. It only had to exist. He put away the diagram and straightened like a man who'd just placed the first brick of a trap. He told Miles that from now on, he wanted every camera recalibrated, the blind spot filled, footage stored in 2 places, and alerts triggered if anyone logged in. Miles understood immediately, gave one nod, and left like a shadow. Declan stayed alone for a few more minutes, staring at the blank space on the diagram, the way you stare at a crack in a wall. He didn't doubt anymore. The problem wasn't a feeling, it was design, and that design only benefited one person. He walked out of the study, moved down the hallway, and caught Vanessa talking on the phone, her voice bright and easy, as if life were one long party. When she saw him, she hung up quickly, her smile snapping into place on cue. Declan answered with perfect calm, the kind of calm a man has when he can sit at a negotiation table with an enemy and still call it dinner. He announced that over the next few days he had to travel for work, something at the port and a meeting that couldn't be moved. Vanessa blinked once, then grabbed the opportunity like a key. She asked about the schedule, the time, who would be with him, her concern measured and proper. Declan answered just enough, not more, not less, as if he truly were only a busy man. Inside him, the decision had already locked shut. This would be a false trip, a disappearance meant to see who would step out of the dark. At midday, Declan called Madeline into the kitchen while Vanessa was in the living room. He didn't speak at length. He didn't make her feel like an ally only to expose her later. He only instructed her in the lightest command he could manage. Keep everything normal. Don't confront. Don't argue. Prioritize being in areas with cameras. If anything felt strange, don't prove. Don't explain. Just redirect and notify Miles in the way they'd agreed on. Madeline nodded, feeling as if she were stepping into fog where only Declan could see the road. She didn't ask why. She only sensed that from this point on, every small action would matter like a chess piece. Declan left the next morning with the motorcade as usual. Vanessa stood by the door and waved, her smile gentle, her eyes shining like a woman who knew how to wait for her husband. When the iron gate closed, Madeline didn't know where Declan had really gone. She only knew the air in the house changed, as if someone had just removed a pin and let what had been restrained breathe freely. Small errors began to appear, the kind no one could call a crime, but enough to make someone like Madeline look careless. The boys' toys were moved out of their basket and left scattered where they didn't belong, as if someone wanted mess to be seen. A small jacket was placed on the living room chair instead of being hung where it should be. A line on the schedule was altered, shifting mealtime. Madeline checked everything, corrected it, kept the rhythm steady, but she could feel clearly that an invisible hand was trying to create traces. Vanessa walked past, glanced over, and let out a very small sigh. Not a direct accusation, only enough for that sigh to become an unspoken charge. She said things that sounded like concern, but every word aimed in one direction. Madeline should be more careful. She should remember her role. She shouldn't make things messy when Mr. Ward was away. Madeline clenched her teeth and didn't answer. She pulled the boys into the playroom, chose simple games, kept her voice gentle, kept everything consistent like a lifeline. And what chilled her most was that Declan didn't call. Not one message, not one check-in. Part of her wanted to believe he'd truly left. The other part understood the silence was deliberate, like a trap set at the bottom of a lake. By evening, Vanessa changed her dress, applied light makeup, and moved around the house with an air of busy purpose, as if preparing for something she didn't want anyone to ask about. Madeline took the boys upstairs, read a story, turned off the light, and sat for a few minutes until their breathing evened out. She had just stood when her phone vibrated. Not a message from Declan, not an unknown number, but a sound thin as a blade cutting through the night, coming from the hallway. Madeline cracked the door and looked out and saw Vanessa at the far end of the hall, her back turned, phone to her ear, her voice lowered but still clear enough to slip through the quiet space. She wasn't calling a friend. She was calling with command in her tone. "Trent," she said, and the name dropped like a stone. Then Vanessa ended with a short sentence, sharp and empty, as if clearing a table before cutting the cake. "Tonight. Make it clean." Madeline stood unmoving, her hand gripping the doorframe, feeling as if the whole house had tilted slightly, just enough for her to understand that the blind spot on Miles's diagram wasn't only a technical flaw, it was an invitation. And tonight, someone would walk into that darkness, believing no one could see. Darkness fell faster than usual. Low clouds crawled across the sky like a heavy curtain, and wind slipped through the trees in front of the iron gate, making a dry, brittle sound like someone turning the pages of an old book. Declan's black car sat parked in a hidden corner across the road, lights off, windows sealed tight. He hadn't left the city like he'd said. He'd only left the line of sight. On the monitor set on the passenger seat, the newly recalibrated camera system showed each frame in sharp detail. The hallway, the living room, the kitchen door, the staircase. There were no blind spots anymore. Declan sat motionless, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes never leaving the screen, like a man watching a chess match where every move carried a price. Inside the house, Vanessa moved lightly, as if preparing for an ordinary evening. She changed her top, adjusted her hair, then paused in the living room where warm yellow light spilled down like a small stage. A few minutes later, the side door opened and Trent stepped in, not carrying the haste of someone rushing, but the familiarity of someone who knew he was expected. Declan watched them stand close together, their voices lowered but still clear enough for the microphone to catch a few words. The paperwork was ready, Vanessa said. The travel plans had been prepared, and all it would take was a few signatures for everything to shift the way they wanted. Trent replied that obstacles had to be removed before anything was announced, his voice not loud, but deliberate and calculated. Declan didn't blink. He didn't hear a direct confession, but the way they spoke about arranging things, about making sure no one interfered, was enough to paint the picture. Upstairs, Madeline was putting toys back into the basket when she realized Evan and Graham weren't laughing the way they had that afternoon. The two boys clung to her hands tighter, their eyes repeatedly flicking toward the hallway that led down to the stairs. Graham tugged at her sleeve, saying nothing out loud, but enough for her to understand. Madeline felt the air change, not because of the wind, but because an invisible tension spread across each step. She crouched to the boys' level and kept her voice soft the way she always did. "Let's play the safe house game," she said, taking one child's hand on each side. She turned the playroom into a small fortress by pulling a table closer to the door, turning on music low enough to create a steady rhythm, making every movement into a game. "We stay inside this circle of light. Whoever leaves loses," she said, smiling as if it were only mischief. Evan nodded. Graham pressed against her. And in that moment, Madeline understood that a child's fear never lies. Downstairs, Vanessa and Trent kept talking, mentioning that they needed to move quickly and avoid areas with recording. Declan watched the screen and saw clearly the way Vanessa glanced toward the stairs as if calculating. He knew their original plan might have been tomorrow, or next week, but something in the way Vanessa checked the clock told him they wouldn't wait. The wind outside strengthened, and Declan's car trembled faintly. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and waited. Inside the house, Madeline heard footsteps near the staircase. Her heart raced, but her voice stayed even. "Who wants to be the fortress captain?" she asked, trying to turn each second into padding. She sent a quick message to Miles the way they'd agreed. Only one word, a code they'd set in advance. At that exact moment, the doorbell rang. Not on schedule. Not as expected. Madeline looked at the clock. Too early for anything normal. On the screen in the car, Declan saw Trent step out to open the side door, then return to the living room with a confidence heavier than before. Vanessa appeared behind him, her eyes brightening as if everything were moving along the right track. Trent didn't wait for the hour they'd discussed. He'd arrived earlier than planned. And Vanessa, with a smile that said she already held the winning hand, began to climb the stairs. Vanessa climbed the stairs with a confident rhythm, as if every step belonged to her. Behind her, Trent stood at the foot of the staircase, hands in his pockets, watching like a man waiting for a performance to begin. The playroom door opened after Vanessa tapped twice, just polite enough, and her smile appeared before her voice did. "My sweet boys, we need to go out right now. There's a little surprise trip," she said, her tone honeyed. Madeline stood in the middle of the room, one hand resting lightly on Evan's shoulder, the other keeping Graham close, and she felt the immediate tightening of small fingers. Vanessa stepped in another pace, her eyes sweeping over the table and chairs arranged into a circle of light, then stopping on Madeline. "Mr. Ward has agreed to let the boys go out for a change of air," she said, smiling as if it were the most reasonable decision in the world. But the urgency in the way she pressed on the words "right now" warped the sentence into something crooked. Madeline didn't raise her voice. She didn't act defiant. She only shifted one very small step, placing herself between Vanessa and the boys, leaving enough distance not to touch anyone, but enough to block a path. "This isn't on the schedule. We should wait for Mr. Ward," she said, her voice level, her eyes never leaving Vanessa. For a split second, the smile at Vanessa's mouth faltered, then was replaced by a performance of disappointment. "You're overreacting, Madeline," she said, her tone light but cold. "We're only taking the children out for a few hours. Don't make something simple complicated." Trent looked up from the bottom of the stairs. He said nothing, but his presence thickened the air. Madeline felt her heart slam, but she remembered Declan's instructions. Don't confront. Don't argue. Just keep everything inside the light. She angled her head toward the hallway where the camera had been recalibrated and stepped back one beat, drawing the boys with her. "If this trip has been arranged, then the paperwork must already be completed," she said, as if she were only asking to understand. "So the papers are already signed." The question dropped like a small stone into still water. Vanessa didn't manage to hide her irritation. "Of course," she answered at once, her voice a shade higher. "Everything's been handled. We just need to get them out of here before someone keeps making them attach in the wrong place." The words came out faster than she'd intended, and in that moment, Vanessa was no longer the perfect woman on a charity stage. She was someone in a hurry. Madeline didn't need another word. She only kept her face calm, as if waiting for one final confirmation. At the bottom of the stairs, Trent shifted slightly, as if to urge her along, but Vanessa had already said more than enough. On the monitor inside the car, Declan saw the entire scene, heard every word through the microphone, and saw clearly the way Vanessa had accidentally confirmed that paperwork had been prepared without his signature. He didn't need bigger proof than that. He didn't need to hear more. His hand settled on the car door handle. Inside the house, Vanessa took another step, her gaze sharpening, and Madeline understood the test had reached its edge. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She only kept the boys behind her and said it again. "We're waiting for Mr. Ward." Outside on the road, Declan's car door opened into the night, metal making a quiet sound in the wind. He stepped out, his eyes no longer those of an observer. He decided to walk into the house. The front door swung open before Vanessa could say another word, and Declan's footsteps struck the wood floor like a decisive drumbeat. He didn't run. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked into the hallway's light with eyes cold as steel. "Step away," he said, his voice low but strong enough to silence everything else. Vanessa turned, her smile vanishing in an instant, then replaced by a perfectly shaped shock so convincing that without the camera recording, people might have believed it was real. Trent halted at the foot of the stairs when he saw Miles and 2 security men appear behind Declan like shadows that had been calculated in advance. They didn't shout. They didn't create chaos. They only moved in, cutting off the space between Trent and the staircase with quick, clean motion. No one was shoved to the ground. There was no loud crash. Only control. Vanessa lifted a hand to her mouth, eyes wide, her voice trembling as if she'd just witnessed something horrific. "You're threatening me," she said, stepping back once, both arms wrapping around herself as if searching for protection. Declan didn't look at her. He didn't move toward her. He only raised his eyes slightly, stared straight at the corner of the ceiling where the camera was recording, and spoke a single sentence. "The record speaks." The house went so quiet you could hear wind at the windows. Vanessa blinked, as if she couldn't understand why her performance wasn't landing. She turned toward Trent, searching for confirmation, but Trent was being held in place where he couldn't move forward one more step. Behind Madeline, Evan and Graham stopped keeping distance. The 2 boys rushed to her first, arms wrapping around her waist on instinct, and only then did they look up at Declan. The moment didn't last long, but it was long enough for Declan to understand a truth that made his chest feel heavy. His sons chose the place that felt safe before they chose him. He didn't blame them. He only stood there, watching 2 small bodies tuck behind Madeline's back, and realized he'd allowed this gap to exist for too long. He climbed a few steps and stopped close enough that his voice didn't need to rise. "No one is taking the boys out of this house without my signature," he said, his gaze moving from Vanessa to Trent and back to Madeline, like confirmation that the rules of the game had changed. Vanessa broke into tears, drops falling fast as if they'd been prepared in advance. "I only want what's best for the children," she said, her voice cracking. "You've misunderstood." But Declan didn't argue. He didn't debate intentions. He had data. Miles handed him a small device, a copy saved right on site. Declan took it and called Sloane without leaving the hallway. His voice stayed calm, as he said he needed her in the middle of the night, needed a safe duplicate and a legal path forward before any story could be told outside. Sloane didn't ask much. She only said she'd be there within an hour. Vanessa saw that movement and understood everything had slipped beyond her control. She stopped crying abruptly, her eyes shifting into calculation, but it was too late. When Sloane arrived with a briefcase and the steady composure of someone not blinded by stage lights, Declan handed her the storage device like a deciding card. Sloane watched a short segment, her expression unchanged, then nodded. She told Declan quietly that the footage was clear enough to prove everything hadn't happened the way a story might be constructed. But she also warned what Declan had already anticipated. "She won't wait for court," Sloane said, her voice low and firm. "She'll go public first." Declan looked up toward the 2nd floor, where Madeline was holding Graham and gripping Evan's hand, and for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about reputation or power. He was thinking about protecting the people standing in that light. And when Sloane repeated that the real battle might begin on a television screen instead of in a courtroom, Declan understood that tonight had only been the beginning. That night, they didn't go back to the Ward house. The motorcade turned onto a road with fewer lights, leading to a low 1-story home set behind a line of maple trees, where the glass doors didn't reflect the city's glow, only held the quiet of darkness. No one called it a safe house. Declan only said it was another location. But the way Miles stood at the door, the way 2 security men checked every corner before letting the boys step inside, made it clear this place had been chosen for one reason only: safety. Inside, everything was tidy and minimal, as if it had been waiting for a situation no one wanted to name. Madeline carried Graham into a small bedroom at the end of the hall. Evan followed, his hand still gripping her shirt as if she might vanish if he let go. The new room felt unfamiliar, the smell of paint and clean fabric strange, the light softer but not the familiar light from the old house. The boys didn't cry out loud. They only lay still, eyes wide in the dark, listening to every small sound as if this house might suddenly speak. Madeline sat between the two beds, her voice still gentle, still steady the way it had been on other nights, telling a story about a fortress and loyal guards. But tonight, she was the one who needed to believe that story. She was so tired her shoulders ached. But every time Evan shifted, every time Graham's breathing quickened more than usual, she set her hand on their foreheads, as if confirming they were still here, still safe. In the living room, Declan didn't sit down. He stood by the window, speaking with Miles in a low, decisive voice, ordering more security, changing vehicle routes, limiting the number of people who knew this location to a very small circle. He didn't shout, he didn't slam a fist on the table, but every sentence he spoke was a boundary line. In his world, silence was built with discipline, not with promises. When things finally eased, he walked to the children's door. He didn't go in right away. He leaned against the frame and watched Madeline sitting between the two beds like a small but unyielding pillar. She didn't realize he was watching. She only kept telling the story until her voice went hoarse and the boys finally closed their eyes, though they still startled now and then as if hearing footsteps inside memory. Declan stepped in, so lightly the wooden floor didn't speak. He bent to pick up a stuffed bear that had fallen to the floor and placed it back into Graham's hands, his movements slow and careful, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. Madeline looked up, exhausted but not broken. She was about to say she would stay awake a little longer, but Declan only gave a slight shake of his head. "Get some rest," he said. "I'm here." She didn't argue. She stood, walked into the hallway, and left Declan sitting on the edge of the bed, watching his sons sleep in a room that wasn't theirs. In the dim light, he saw Evan clutching a small toy car. He picked it up, turned it gently, and noticed a strip of clear tape on the underside, sealing a narrow slit that didn't belong to the original design. Nothing dangerous, just something odd, as if someone had opened it and closed it again. Declan didn't speak. He only looked at the tape for a few seconds, then set the car back in place. It wasn't evidence large enough to convict anyone, but it was a sign that the children's space had been touched in a way no one had asked permission for. When he stepped out of the room, he called Miles again, his voice calm but colder than before. "From now on, every item that belongs to the boys has to be checked before it goes into their room," he said. "No exceptions." Miles didn't ask why. He understood that in Declan's world, small details were always the door to something larger. The night moved slowly. Madeline sat alone in the small living room, holding a cup of water that had gone cold, listening to the wind at the door like a reminder that nothing was over. She thought about the anonymous message. She thought about Vanessa's smile on the charity stage. She thought about the line about a woman at the helm. And while this temporary house kept them safe from the old walls, Madeline understood that the real battle might not happen in the darkness of a hallway, but under the harsh glare of public opinion. Before she let her eyes close for a moment, she saw Declan standing at the front door, phone to his ear, his voice low but steady. He wasn't only protecting an address, he was rebuilding the idea of home. But out there, the city was still awake, and somewhere, another story might already have begun to be written, waiting for the moment it would rise like a wave. The next morning, before the early light had a chance to warm the temporary house, Miles's phone began vibrating nonstop on the kitchen table, and only minutes later the quiet air was pulled tight by something even more dangerous than last night's darkness. A video was spreading online, edited clean and sharp, short enough to shock, long enough to create its own story. In it, Declan appeared as a man stepping into a house with cold eyes and a hard voice, with no context before or after. Vanessa's words were left intact. The explanations were cut away, and the moment Madeline stood on the staircase was placed, so she looked like someone intruding into an unstable family. Within only a few hours, the name Ward slid out of financial headlines and fell into the rumor column. Comments stacked up fast, confident in tone, as if everyone had witnessed the whole truth. Declan watched the clip once, without rewinding. He didn't need to see it again to know who had built it. Vanessa wasn't waiting for any hearing. She had moved first. Outside, a few unfamiliar cars appeared at the end of the road, lenses flashing behind dark-tinted glass. Even though this location had been kept quiet, Madeline's name had been dug up from old records. A reporter had gone to the small apartment where she'd rented a room before moving into full-time work at the ward house, and the landlord called her with a cautious voice. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want their building's name mentioned in the news. Madeline stood in the living room, with the phone pressed to her ear, hearing each sentence like a pebble thrown into her chest. She didn't blame anyone. She only looked toward the hallway where Evan and Graham were drawing with Dr. Page, and she felt herself standing again at an old threshold, where people looked at her and saw only a problem. She walked up to Declan and set the phone down on the table. "I should leave," she said, her voice so calm it surprised even her. "I don't want the boys pulled into this because of me." Declan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes not angry, not accusing, only weighing. "Leaving is exactly what they want," he said, each word falling with clarity. "If you disappear, their story becomes complete the way they're telling it." Madeline didn't answer right away. She looked back at the screen where the clip kept looping, heard Vanessa's voice in another segment, saying she only wanted to protect the children from unsuitable influences. Sloane walked in with a folder in her hands and said the media team behind Vanessa wasn't amateur. A crisis management firm had been hired in advance. The script had been prepared, and the airtime for an evening program had already been set. They were building a story with Vanessa at the center, Declan as a frightening, powerful man, and Madeline as a shadowy figure forcing her way in. Declan didn't react impulsively. He only nodded once, as if he'd expected this. He told Miles to tighten security and instructed Sloane to prepare the legal response, but not to release anything too fast. Across the city, studio lights came on. Vanessa sat in a velvet chair, hair combed into perfect order, eyes slightly red as if she'd cried just enough to create an effect. When the host turned to her and asked if she wanted to say anything about the controversial video, Vanessa drew a small breath, then looked straight into the lens. "I only want the children to be safe," she said, her voice shaking just enough for the whole city to believe they were watching a wounded woman. And with that single opening line, the real war began. After Vanessa's line spread across the evening broadcasts, Declan didn't respond with a public statement. He responded with quiet movement. Before the sun rose high, the motorcade left the first temporary house and headed to another location, deeper into the suburbs, where there were no curious neighbors and no reporters waiting at the end of the road. The new house wasn't as luxurious as the Ward estate, but it was discreet enough, solid enough, and most importantly, no one outside Declan's small circle knew it existed. Once everyone was settled, Declan gathered them in the living room and spoke briefly, as if laying down regulations for an organization rather than a family. "From now on, there are new rules," he said, and he called them the Ward rules. Evan and Graham's routine would not change, no matter how loud the outside world became. No one would use the boys' images to answer the media. Not a single interview, not a single photograph would be released without his approval and the attorney's. Madeline's privacy would be protected like that of any other member of this house. She was not a shield, and she was not a pawn. Madeline heard those words and didn't know whether to feel relieved or more uneasy, because every rule felt like a wall being built, and walls always had two sides. Dr. Page arrived in the afternoon carrying a small bag of toys and drawing paper. She didn't ask Evan and Graham about what had happened. She only sat on the floor with them, starting with a simple game about building houses from wooden blocks and telling stories about rooms with doors that were open and doors that were closed. Gradually, the boys picked up colored pencils and drew. The first lines were messy, but then a repeated image began to appear, a door standing under a long light, a key larger than normal placed right in the middle of the page. Dr. Page didn't say much. She only took notes, her eyes gentle but focused. When Madeline looked at those drawings, she felt her throat tighten. She had seen the boys' eyes drift toward the hallway before they looked at her. Now they were drawing it in color. Declan stood at the doorway, not stepping inside, only watching over Dr. Page's shoulder. He didn't ask what every detail meant. He understood enough to know the fear wasn't imagined. It had shape, it had location, and it had light falling on it. That evening, when things finally quieted, Madeline sat alone at the small dining table, watching the news with the sound off, seeing Vanessa appear once more, calm and fully in control. Declan came in and set a cup of coffee in front of her, a small gesture that felt unusual. He didn't offer comfort. He only asked one question. "Are you afraid?" Madeline stayed silent for a few seconds, then nodded. Declan didn't argue with that fear. He only said fear wasn't what made a person weak. It was what proved there was something worth protecting. The doorbell rang right then, cutting through the still air. Miles appeared in the doorway with a man in a dark suit, posture straight, eyes scanning every detail as if recording it all in his mind. The man stepped in without needing a long introduction. "Agent Keller," he said, calm but carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. He looked at Declan the way you look at a problem that hasn't been solved yet. "I can shield you from this storm," Keller said, his gaze never leaving Declan. "Or I can end it another way." And in the small room of the temporary house, among drawings of a door and a key, Declan understood that the battle was no longer only in Vanessa's hands. Agent Keller didn't sit down right away when he stepped into the small living room of the temporary house. He stood there for a few seconds, watching the way Declan held his spine straight, the way Madeline instinctively shifted half a step back toward the hallway where the boys were sleeping, and the way Miles kept just enough distance so the air wouldn't turn into confrontation. When Keller finally sat, he set his leather briefcase on the table like a man opening a new chess match. "I don't care about your family drama," he said, his voice even and dry. "I care about the shipments moving through the port on the east side of the city over the last 6 months. There are financial movements that don't match. There are logistics companies that suddenly change names, change signatories, then disappear." He looked straight at Declan. "You know what I'm talking about?" Declan didn't deny it, and he didn't confirm it. He only asked one short question. "What do you want?" Keller smiled very slightly. "Cooperation. Internal information. In exchange, the custody matter won't be dug deeper than it needs to be. The media won't get additional anonymous sources from federal agencies. You'll have quiet to handle your family situation." The word quiet fell like a false promise. Declan understood better than anyone that quiet in this world always had a price. If he agreed, he would have to sacrifice part of the network that had kept him standing for years. If he refused, Keller had enough tools to turn every investigation into a long storm, enough to make the upcoming hearing no longer only Vanessa's private matter. Madeline listened in silence. She didn't understand every layer of meaning in logistics and finance, but she understood the feeling of being placed between two blades. When Keller left, dropping the line that he would wait for an answer within a short window, the room felt as if the oxygen had been pulled out. Declan stood alone by the window, looking out at the small yard where there were no reporters, but there was still darkness. For the first time in many years, he had to weigh not only reputation and power, but the drawings of keys and doors in the children's room. Power could buy silence, but it couldn't buy back his son's trust if he chose wrong. That afternoon, Madeline received a call from her younger brother, Daniel. His voice shook slightly, trying to sound normal. A man had come to Daniel's workplace offering a new position with double the pay, asking him to sign quickly, saying it was connected to major transportation projects. "Too good to be true," Daniel said, and asked if she knew anything about it. Madeline's heart went cold. She looked toward Declan, and her look alone was enough for him to understand the game had spread into another border. Declan didn't explode. He didn't call anyone to threaten them. He called Miles and told him to verify the identity of the man, the company behind the offer, and any ties to the current media network. Within a few hours, Miles confirmed the company had been registered only recently, and the legal director's name was connected to one of the funds that had previously financed Vanessa's image campaign. Declan ordered every line of access to Daniel cut off, moved him to a safer position, increased surveillance, and preserved every piece of evidence of that approach. He wouldn't let anyone touch Madeline's family, not even with a sweet offer. Madeline watched the way he handled everything without noise, only through precise, cold steps, and for the first time, she understood what power looked like when it was used as a shield instead of a weapon. But the quiet didn't last. Declan's phone buzzed when the sky had just gone dark. Sloane was on the line, her tone more urgent than usual. "Vanessa is about to file a packet with the court," she said, intended to prove Madeline is not suitable to be near the boys. If that packet is accepted even temporarily, Madeline could be ordered to leave the house immediately while the case is pending. Declan didn't ask for details. He only looked toward the hallway where the children's room light was still on, and understood that time was no longer on his side. Sloane's message about the packet Vanessa was preparing to file with the court made the air inside the temporary house thicken like the moment before a storm breaks. Declan understood that if they relied only on the footage from that night, They were still playing on the part of the field Vanessa had already decorated with her story. They needed another piece, someone who'd been close enough to see how the narrative had been staged in advance. Miles mentioned a name he'd once dismissed as not important enough: Clara Whitman, a former communications assistant who'd worked directly for Vanessa during the period of preparing charity events and handling image crisis management. Clara had left her position a few weeks earlier, the official reason being a career shift. But according to Miles, she'd walked away after a closed-door meeting that had run unusually long. Sloane reached out through an intermediary attorney and offered a private meeting. No pressure, only a chance to tell the truth if Clara wanted to. The meeting took place at a small coffee shop far from downtown, where no lenses were pointed at them. Clara arrived late in a gray coat, her eyes scanning the room more than meeting anyone's gaze. She sat down, set her hand on her coffee cup, and didn't drink. "I don't want to get involved in this," Clara said immediately, her voice tight as a drawn wire. "I have my career. I don't want to become a traitor." Sloane didn't push. She only said no one was asking Clara to go in front of the media. They only needed her to confirm a few things if she were legally subpoenaed. Clara shook her head and said everything had been prepared carefully, that people with power always knew how to hide traces. She stood as if to leave, and in that moment everything looked like a failure. But as Clara turned away, she stopped for a beat, as if something unsaid were holding her in place. She turned back, and her eyes weren't defensive anymore. They were tired. "There's a folder," Clara said quietly. "A folder on the internal server for the communications team. It contains different versions of the video, before and after editing. I backed up part of it because I didn't believe what was happening was right." Sloane didn't show urgency. She only asked if Clara still had that copy. Clara gave a very small nod. She pulled a small storage device from her bag and said it contained the edit logs, directive emails from an account tied to Vanessa, and metadata showing the clip had been prepared before that night was even over. "I don't want to destroy anyone," Clara said, "but I don't want to keep pretending I don't know." When Sloane took the device, she knew she was holding something that could change the direction of the hearing. Declan heard the report afterward in the living room of the temporary house, his eyes not flashing with victory, only sinking deeper. He understood that every witness who stepped into the light would pay a price. He ordered that Clara be given full legal protection, and that her name not be leaked. Across the city, Vanessa was finishing the final steps for her filing, believing the story was controlled. She didn't know that someone who'd once sat in her meeting room had chosen to listen to conscience instead of fear. And when Sloane placed the storage device on the table and said they didn't only have testimony, but original data with clear timestamps and a clear sending source, Declan understood the battle ahead wouldn't rest on emotion alone. It would rest on truth that could be proven. Vanessa's packet was filed with the court on Monday morning, and within hours the name Madeline Pierce was pulled back into headlines as a suspicious figure. The file was thick, heavy with printed messages, screenshots, statements written in a tone so professional it was hard to question. Madeline received a request to appear before authorities to verify certain details related to the care of the two boys. And though there were no criminal charges, the mere act of being summoned was enough to ignite public opinion again. Online comments shifted from doubt to certainty, as if people had just found the missing piece to complete the story they had already chosen to believe. Inside the temporary house, Madeline sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded together to keep them from shaking. She watched the news without sound, saw her image clipped from unfavorable frames, and for a moment she believed she had reached the end of the road. Sloane arrived as soon as she received a copy of the filing, carrying the familiar calm of someone used to absorbing sudden blows. It didn't take her long to spot what didn't align. The file creation times on several documents didn't match the dates recorded in the written statements. The metadata on some screenshots showed they had been edited after the events had supposedly taken place. Sloane laid each detail on the table like placing chess pieces, pointing out that the constructed narrative had seams too smooth to be natural. When she presented her findings to Declan and Madeline, no one rushed to celebrate. They understood that discovering errors didn't mean public opinion would turn overnight, but it was a crack wide enough to let in a different wind. More unexpected was a call from a name Declan hadn't expected to hear again: Harold Bennett, the former house manager of the Ward estate, who had left shortly after Vanessa moved in. Harold asked to meet privately, his voice trembling but firm. He said he had stayed silent too long, that he had witnessed the way Vanessa requested the children's rooms be arranged to create specific images for events, the way she insisted stories be adjusted before being shared with the press. Harold didn't bring footage. He brought an old notebook, filled with instructions he had been told to carry out, with clear dates written beside them. Those notes matched some of the changes mentioned in Vanessa's filing, but in a different order. It showed the story had been rearranged. Harold's appearance felt like a final piece no one had expected, a witness with nothing left to lose, except his conscience. When the room finally grew quiet, Declan turned to Madeline, his eyes no longer those of a man issuing commands, but of someone who recognized he had been one step too late. "I should have protected the truth sooner," he said, his voice low and sincere enough that Madeline had to look away to steady herself. She didn't answer with forgiveness or accusation. She only gave a small nod, as if accepting they were standing on the same side now. The hearing day arrived faster than they expected. Outside the courthouse, reporters lined up, microphones raised, flashes bursting. Vanessa stepped out of her car in a light-colored suit, her hair styled perfectly, her smile soft as if this were only another press conference. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone certain she held the advantage, and when the courtroom doors opened, the entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which story would be believed. The hearing room wasn't large, but the air inside felt heavy as lead when Vanessa stepped forward, her posture calm and her voice tuned just enough to reach for emotion. She retold everything as a chain of choices made for the children's best interests, describing Declan as a man too practiced in control, too cold to understand his son's subtle needs, and painting Madeline as a woman with her own motives, stepping into a wounded family to claim a place. Her story was coherent, full of details that sounded reasonable, and each time she paused to wipe away tears, a few faces in the room softened with her. Declan stayed still, hands resting on his thighs, showing nothing, as if he understood that any reaction now would only feed the image Vanessa wanted to build. When it was Sloane's turn, she didn't begin with argument. She began with one simple request: permission to play the full recording. The screen lit up, and what had been cut before now appeared in full, from the first moment to the last. She pointed out what had been removed from the version that went viral, compared file creation times, and displayed metadata proving the clip had been processed before it was released to the public. Each fact was presented not like an attack, but like a piece restoring order to the truth. Next, Dr. Page stepped forward with the steadiness of someone who works with children every day. She didn't offer shocking details. She spoke only about Evan and Graham's clear progress when they lived in a consistent environment, about the way they showed stress responses when certain elements were mentioned, and about drawings that repeatedly returned to the image of a door and a key as an expression of a lost sense of control. She emphasized that their current stability was necessary for development, and that any sudden change could cause long-term psychological harm. The room went quiet when Graham, seated beside Madeline, suddenly tightened his grip on her hand and said, softly but clearly enough for the microphone to catch, "I want to stay where the light is on." The simple sentence wasn't legal evidence, but it touched what every report was trying to say. The judge looked up, scanned the documents, scanned each face, and finally announced a temporary decision to maintain the current caregiving arrangement until a final conclusion was reached, allowing Madeline to remain with the boys while the matter was reviewed further. A small wave of breath left the room, but Declan didn't fully relax. As he stepped out of the courthouse, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Keller appeared on the screen, brief and cold. She didn't build all of this alone. Declan looked back at the building behind him, where Vanessa was still answering questions with a smile that hadn't faded. And he understood that even though they'd just won something precious, time, the game ran deeper than what they could see. After the judge's temporary decision, life didn't return to what it had been. It found a new rhythm, slower and more real. There were no more parties, no more stage lights, only a small kitchen where Evan sat drawing while Graham tried to pour himself milk and spilled a little onto the table. Madeline didn't rush to wipe it up. She let the boys grab paper towels themselves, let them fix the mistake themselves, like a lesson that control doesn't have to come from fear. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to fill the empty space that used to be covered by heavy silence. Declan appeared in the kitchen every morning, not with a phone pressed to his ear, but with his sleeves rolled up, making coffee, and asking the boys which toy they wanted to bring to therapy that day. He drove them himself to see Dr. Page, waited in the hallway without scrolling through financial news, only looking through the frosted glass and waiting until the session ended. He came home at the time he'd promised, even if some call was waiting. In this private space, he didn't use power to command. He learned how to ask, how to listen, and how to accept that some things can't be forced. Madeline watched that change with the caution of someone who'd lost more than she'd gained. She told Declan clearly that she didn't want to become a symbol for some romantic story in the press, didn't want the image of a new family built up like a victory. She needed safety and respect before she needed anything else. Declan didn't argue. He nodded and said he didn't want a fairy tale. He only wanted what was right. One evening, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, Declan sat on the back steps, watching the garden lights reflect on wet grass. Madeline came out in a thin sweater and sat down at a careful distance. He spoke without looking at her, saying he'd once believed distance was how you protected the people you loved, that if you didn't get too close, you wouldn't have to lose anyone again. He admitted that fear of loss had frozen his emotions, turning him into the kind of father who stood outside a bedroom door instead of walking in. Madeline didn't offer grand comfort. She only said fear doesn't disappear by avoiding it, and sometimes the bravest thing is staying. The house was no longer a gilded cage. It was a place with simple rules, ordinary breakfasts, and evenings where no one had to perform a role. But as Madeline stood to go back inside, her phone vibrated lightly in her pocket. A message from an unknown number. No profile photo, only one line glowing on the dark screen. "You think the house is safe now?" Madeline stared at the words for a few seconds before locking the screen. Inside, Graham shifted in his sleep, the sound faint, and even though the house was quiet, both she and Declan understood that this peace might only be the lull between two waves. The truth didn't arrive in a single night, but when it finally came, it carried enough weight to turn public opinion. The original data, the edit logs, Clara's testimony, and Harold's notebook were all presented in full to the proper authorities. Vanessa and Trent were no longer standing in the light of a media stage. They were standing in front of real legal process. There was no loud spectacle, no dramatic footage, only decisions made according to the law. When the full uncut recording was released, when metadata analysis was confirmed by an independent expert, the story began to shift. The comments that had rushed to condemn turned into silence, and then into regret. Public opinion isn't always fair, but when the truth is clear enough, it has the power to correct itself. Declan didn't hold a victory press conference. He didn't appear in front of cameras to give a long speech. Instead, a few months later, a brief statement was released announcing the creation of a fund to support children and foster families, governed by an independent board, transparent in finances and operations. It didn't carry his name in a showy way. It didn't use Evan and Graham's images as symbols. It wasn't a reputation polishing campaign. It was a meaningful act of repair, a way for him to admit that power only matters when it's used to protect people who are more vulnerable. In the house, no longer surrounded by lenses, the afternoon passed in an ordinary way. Evan tugged Declan's hand out into the yard. Graham held Madeline's hand, then the two boys suddenly switched places, each one taking one hand of the two adults. No one told them to do it. They only followed instinct. The four of them walked through the front door together, not sneaking, not rushing, but upright and calm. The door closed behind them, no longer a gilded cage from the past, but a place they were choosing to stay in together. Family isn't always born from blood. Sometimes it's built from trust, from standing beside each other when everything could fall apart. But in another part of the city, Agent Keller was turning the pages of a thick file tied to the port and the logistics routes. The names inside didn't point only to Vanessa. They ran deeper, toward people who had never appeared in public. When Keller texted Declan a short line saying the game wasn't over, Declan didn't look surprised. He watched his sons laughing in the living room and understood that the next fight, if it came, would still turn on one thing: protecting his family and protecting the truth. This story can end here, but its aftershock reminds us how fragile trust can be, and how important adult responsibility is in creating a safe environment for children. Sometimes the strongest thing isn't controlling others. It's learning how to change yourself. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever witnessed a moment when the truth took time before people were willing to listen? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear what's sitting deep in your heart. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so we can keep bringing you more meaningful and compelling stories every day. Thank you for staying until the end of the video. Wishing everyone watching good health, a happy life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.